Good morning. Happy Sunday. I hope you're going to get the chance to fellowship with some folk today on the Lord's Day. And we're into the period of David's life when he was a fugitive, when he was moving from place to place to keep away from Saul and his men. Of course, Saul was king of the entire nation, and his soldiers were everywhere, and it was very difficult for David to hide amongst his own people. So he runs away from David, and chapter 21 tells us about how he sought help from a priest, Ahimelech, and he was given Goliath's sword, which had been entrusted to Ahimelech. And then he goes to the king of Gath, who of course was a Philistine. This is at the end of chapter 21. And they are naturally afraid of David because they've heard the saying that's been going around. Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. And so David pretends to be mad and lets his spittle drool down his beard and behaves in a mad way. So he escapes from them. And then chapter 22 opens with a couple of verses. David departed from there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. And when he and his brothers and all his father's house heard it, they went down there to him. And everyone who was in distress, and everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was discontented, gathered to him, and he became captain over them. And there were with him about 400 men. The whole of David's life had changed. He'd gone from being a well-provided for son of a rich man, with access to the king's palace, and with good prospects, really. And suddenly he was out wandering. And all these discontented people came to him, and over a period of time he turned them into a wonderful raiding band, a wonderful fighting force, because he was a leader anointed by God for leadership. He'd been anointed for leadership as king, and this was part of his training. He learned how to manage people. He'd learned how to manage sheep as a shepherd, and he had learned how to manage his own emotions when he was under duress with Saul, and now he was learning how to manage people. All very good training for him for when he became king. And this is the wonderful thing, really. We can see throughout David's life how God prepared him for the role of king. He didn't take a young man who knew nothing and put him into the position of kingship. He was trained in, and he served. He served in leadership, and people gathered to him. But it says something about Saul's kingship, that there were that many men discontented with their lives under Saul as king, who were happier to live on the run with David than where they lived under Saul. It says something about him. There's not much in the rest of the scriptures about people who chose to live a nomadic life rather than live under the rulership of the king that they lived under. So my thought for the day really is about David. He did not, there's no evidence that he trained these men and that he, in order to get the kingship, there's no evidence that he started with these 400 and he slowly added men to it until he had more men on his side than Saul had on his side, and that he started to be aggressive towards Saul. There's no evidence of that at all. This was simply a means of surviving. And he had these men who followed him and who learned from him and trained with him. And David didn't do anything to try and he could have, when he fled from Saul, announced that he'd been anointed king, and declared it and rallied men to him and started a civil war. But he didn't. He didn't. He waited for God to bring about the thing that he had promised him. And this is something which I think marks us out if we are certain of the Lord's anointing on our lives. We will wait for God to work out the details of getting us to where he wants us to be, rather than make every effort to get there ourselves. Doing it God's way sometimes involves waiting and being patient. Standing our ground in our faith, yes, but waiting in patience for God to do what he's promised he will do. And we can trust and know that God will never let us down over his promises. He has always kept his promises. He always will keep his promises. He is a good God. And David spent time with many different people, some who favoured him and some who betrayed him. So have a read of chapter 22, if you will. If you get carried on to 23, do get carried on to 23. But we'll be looking at these different chapters together. So that's 1 Samuel 22 and 23. Have a read of them if you get a chance today. And God bless you today. And remember that God is faithful. He will always keep his promises. Always, always, always. He will never let you down. He will always keep his promises. Look back on your life. See how often God has come through when you least expected it. And he has done things for you that you didn't think were possible. So bless God today with me, and let us rejoice in the Lord's day, and we'll meet again, God willing, tomorrow. God bless you. Bye-bye.